Right, ladies and gentlemen, from the leadership panel, let's move on to the reporting panel, the third panel session for today. Beyond price and quality, ESG impact as a third value add credential. And now before I invite all the panelists, can I get a round of applause from everyone here this afternoon? I just want to see the level of energy that you are giving out today. That you are still having it, because right after this session, we'll be going for our lunch break. So hang in there. Right, ladies and gentlemen, the third panel session, I would like to invite our panelists, Mr. Donald Chan, Managing Director of CDP Asia Pacific, Mr. Ananda Rajah, General Manager, Sustainability, Engineering and Project Management at Duopharma Biotech Berhad. Our third panelist, Mr. Jonathan Labrey, Chief Connectivity and Integrated Reporting Officer of IFRS Foundation. And our fourth panelist, Mr. Daniel Wang, Vice President, Product Strategy, APAC of Moody's ESG Solutions. And the moderator for this session, ladies and gentlemen, is the Malaysia Climate Change and Sustainability Services Leader and Partner at Ernst & Young Consulting Sdn Berhad, as well as the EY ASEAN Integrated Reporting Subject Matter Expert. Please put your hands for Miss Arina Kok.
Thank you very much. A very good afternoon. I think we are between you and lunch, so I'll really very much go straight to today's discussion. So first and foremost, a very good lineup on gentlemen. So we've heard from the earlier panel sessions from Bursa regulators, as well as CP, Unilever. Now let's look at the landscape on when it comes to driving sustainability and how we are seeing the current landscape. So what we have today is really very much, thank you very much for everyone. Now ESG, what we're seeing in the market now, there are a few focus areas, and today for this session, we're going to focus on 4. What's the ESG reporting landscape in the ASEAN region? Now we have Jonathan, who's going to share on this as well. We also have Mr. Donald from CDP. So we're going to cover that, but we're also going to discuss what are the different approaches to ESG reporting, how standards are converging, how this will help improve the quality of disclosure. I think everyone has the fatigue on reporting as well as frameworks, so we're going to unpack that a bit. And we're also going to talk about how setting actionable science-based parameters means you have some foundation. It's not just internally developed. It also looks at science and leveraging on what makes sense as what we have known today to actually turn ESG into meaningful, sustainable action. So we are actually very good to have Mr. Ananda from Duopharma, who will also share from 2015, Duopharma have also embarked on this journey. And last but not least, we're also going to talk about how avoiding greenwashing is important and why it should be avoided. So we do have Mr. Daniel, who will also talk about from his experience from Moody's as well. So first and foremost, let's go to the first panel, first round. Now, what does the sustainability or integrated reporting landscape look like currently in the ASEAN region? So how do we fare compared to the APAC and the rest of the world? So if Asia Pacific is what we feel, Jonathan, lagging in performance, where are the areas and why? So if we can maybe pause here for you to share, I know you have some slides, so let's maybe put up the slides if that's okay.
I don't think I've got slides.
Oh, all right. Sure. We'll kickstart first.
I hope this is working. I don't know if it is. Thanks. Well, hello everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and a great pleasure to be back in Kuala Lumpur as well. My first time back since the horrors of the pandemic, so it's great to be here. And I've worked in Malaysia and Southeast Asia since about 2014, when at that stage I was working for the International Integrated Reporting Council. And the contours of my career since 2020 are an indication of what has been happening in the corporate reporting landscape more generally, because we've been through 2 mergers, 2 consolidations since 2020, and what is beginning to happen now is we're seeing a consolidation globally in the corporate reporting landscape. But I think if I just look to what's happening here in Malaysia and what's happening in ASEAN more generally, I actually think the story here is not quite as bad as maybe you might think it is, or you're not as behind the rest of the world at all. And actually, particularly my background being in integrated reporting, I think there are well over 100 companies in Malaysia now that are adopting the integrated reporting framework, and that is gaining traction across the ASEAN region. I think there are a couple of perceptions that I would make that make ASEAN distinctive in the world. One is that I think that the adoption of the standards, and particularly the corporate reporting frameworks, operate at 2 levels. There is a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. And what we have found is that in ASEAN, the bottom-up approach, in other words, the corporate reporting changes are happening within sustainability reporting teams or within CSR teams, rather than being led by the board and top management of the companies. Quite often it's slow to penetrate the change if it's a bottom-up approach. Change is happening, but it's a lot slower than if you're able to get the board and top management of the companies engaged in that change management process. And so we do find that a large number of companies are taking more of a bottom-up approach in the ASEAN region than maybe the top-down approach that we're seeing in some other parts of the world. Having said that, we are now seeing across ASEAN, and I think Malaysia in many ways is an exemplar of this, the corporate governance codes beginning to change and beginning to signpost to global standards and global corporate reporting frameworks. And that is having an impact, because I think then what that means is that the CFO and the boards of the companies are now taking an interest in standards and framework developments, and we're seeing that happen particularly in this market. What I would say is that there is a huge level of interest across ASEAN in adopting the global standards and the global frameworks. There's a real appetite to leapfrog some of the bad practice that has occurred in the world, including in markets in Western Europe and Western economies. I think there's a real opportunity to learn from decades of really good practice and actually not go on that journey, but actually just adopt the very best practice from day one. So all of those resources are now available, and there's been a huge investment over the last 10 years by the market to develop these voluntary standards and frameworks, and therefore the pickings are there to be taken in terms of adopting the very best governance and reporting standards and frameworks. I think I'll just conclude by saying that if there were 2 areas that I think ASEAN could make a much greater contribution to this conversation, other than adopting, we can talk about that in practice, the standards and the frameworks, it would be in 2 ways. First of all, the organization that I now work for, which is the IFRS Foundation. So we set the global accounting standards, but also now through the new ISSB, the new global sustainability standards for capital markets. We operate on the basis of due process, and what that means is that we will only do things, we will only make changes to the standards or adopt standards and frameworks if the market tells us that that's what they want. So you have to really engage in that process, write the comment letters when there are consultations, and make sure that the voice of Malaysia and ASEAN is actually heard during that process. It's a really important point, and it's one that I've discovered because I come from a voluntary, kind of more of an NGO background, and I would engage with people at conferences like this and take that back, and it would filter through into our strategy. That doesn't work with the IFRS Foundation. You have to write comment letters. There is a real process of deliberation and consideration of those comment letters. And then the second and final point that I would make is that it's really important to be part of the leadership of these organizations. When you see board positions being offered at the ISSB or IFRS Foundation trustee posts or advisory positions within the foundation, and I speak from the IFRS Foundation, but you could be looking at any of the other global influencing organizations in corporate reporting, put yourselves forward, or think of somebody who you could put forward from your market. It's really important to have a role, because that's the best place, the best way of influencing the development from the bottom up, the development both of the standards themselves in detail, but also the philosophy underpinning them. Thank you.
Thanks, Johnson. But I think it's good that we also hear from Moody's. Now, what have you seen in the ASEAN landscape?
Yeah, I think from a regulatory-driven perspective, in terms of reporting, we really see, starting from 2021, this really start to accelerate, not really only in ASEAN, but overall APAC. We see this TCFD-aligned disclosure requirements start to kick in, and then for a lot of jurisdictions, in ASEAN, including Malaysia, Singapore, even Japan, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Australia, they're having mandatory or voluntary frameworks that they actually have a timeline, most likely from last year to 2025 for corporates, financial institutions to really comply. I fully agree with Jonathan on the role that ASEAN can play, but I think it's also very interesting to look at ISSB. I think from this region's perspective, compare with what we see on the US SEC proposal and what's happening in the European region, is regulators in this region seems to want to start with the general guidance first, without asking, the companies must disclose items or things you must do. So it's not at that level yet. But I think with ISSB started to become formalized, and it's very interesting to see how that will cascade down to this jurisdiction level, and how regulators will take the chance to make the guidance more specific. So I think that's something pretty interesting to see. So yeah.
Thanks. So maybe Donald, you want to add something from the CDP perspective?
Yeah. So. We're playing like musical chairs with a mic now. So firstly, CDP, we are a non-profit, but basically we are the global disclosure system on environmental matters. This year, 18,700 companies from 90 countries reported to CDP, representing half of global market cap. In addition, 1,000 cities, including like Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, report to us at the city level. So our data goes to investors, to buyers, and also to government as well. So we work very closely with government on their regulatory part. So I'll touch a bit around the mandatory disclosure regime for environmental matters. So firstly, there's a convergence on TCFD. Both Singapore and Malaysia are more or less quite closely aligned to TCFD. Indonesia and Thailand a bit less so. So OJK and the SEC in Thailand. So that's the first part. But directionally, we are moving towards mandatory disclosure over the next 2 or 3 years. So that's the first part. The scope, obviously, I mentioned about TCFD. Most global alignment is around TCFD. Even though the SEC paper does not explicitly mention it, the reality is most of it is based off TCFD in the SEC regulation. Third aspect is on application. Right now, Scope 1 is pretty much the focus. Scope 2 also is the focus, but right now most areas are not focusing on Scope 3. If you look at the SEC regulation, there is actually potentially to expand into Scope 3 for certain types of companies. So I think that is one area I think that is an improvement that probably needs to be expanded on. The good thing, as you heard from Berhad, they're focusing on 25 metrics. We see alignment around metrics as well. So Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand are aligning along what are the core metrics that need to be disclosed. And with that also, what are the core metrics then that we take moving forward as well. The last point I will make is a practical point. The stock exchanges are leading most of the disclosure. But the reality is that there are a lot of unlisted companies. Okay? Take, for example, in Singapore, the 3 largest power generation companies are private. The largest port operator, PSA, is private. The largest transmission grid is Singapore Power, which is private. So public markets can only have so much influence. The reality also is a large part within ASEAN, like PLN, for example, Indonesia, are private companies. So as much as we want to apply it in the public space, we also have to recognize the private space, and don't worry about the SMEs, also large contributors to the economy, and somehow we need to get them on the journey to environmental disclosure as well. So.
Thank you, Donald. The next part, we actually, John, if it's okay, we go to your slides. Yeah, I know we mentioned about your slides. So I think the key thing is we hear everyone that it is an emerging landscape. In reality, within Asian, just to add on, is Singapore was the first to went on assurance when it comes to carbon emissions because they've implemented carbon tax by 2019. Thailand is the second one that also went on assurance. So we are not ahead in the ASEAN region when it comes to assurance. And you've heard that Bursa have also announced assurance is within the timeline, and as well as TCFD by 2025 as well for listed companies. Bank Negara have not finalized, but is pushing for 2024 TCFD to be finalized on their exposure draft. So we know all of this are coming. But as we look at the multiple ESG frameworks, I think the key thing is we also want to know how does the convergence of all these standards looks like. So Jonathan, over to you.
Great, I think this might work now.
All right.
Thank you. I don't know if the slides are showing, but I can talk through the convergence that has happened anyway. So we've been through a period, as I said in my opening comments, a period of real innovation over the last 10 or 12 years. That is characterized in common parlance as being resulting in an alphabet soup of different standards and framework providers. We've already been hearing about TCFD, and there's IIRC and SASB and GRI and so on. We all know the acronyms. And what that there's a flip side. It's not all negative. I think there's been a huge investment that has taken place and a huge array of good practice and good standards and good frameworks that are out there. But what happened is that there has been no convergence, as has been said, and therefore a lack of comparability and also confusion in the marketplace. And in that context, very difficult to get global acceptance and a global corporate reporting system, which is what most of us who've been involved in these standards and frameworks organizations are really wanting. We want a globally accepted corporate reporting system. And so in 2020, really in the teeth of the pandemic, when all the chief executives of these global organizations were grounded, they couldn't fly around the world and speak at conferences like this. They were actually in their rooms at home. They could get on conference calls and actually for the first time speak to one another about the things that united them. And papers were produced during 2020 that tried to set out CDP, CDSB, IIRC, GRI, SASB, IFRS Foundation, coming together to really identify what were the common threads, what were the principles that really united these organizations. And as a result of that, what you saw were really two worlds that I think now are beginning to come together. There is the impact world, so there is what we call the inside-out world of standard setting, which is what is the impact of your company on the environment and society, and we need standards in order to help that. And what that does is it engages with a broader stakeholder community and also with policymakers, so they can see industries in aggregate and the impact of those industries, and they can set policy according to that information, that data. But what we also found was that you need the outside-in perspective. You need standards that filter that broad universe of information for capital markets, for investors to make decisions today about how they're going to allocate capital. So how does that broad universe of factors, how does that translate into how your organization, how your company is creating value for itself and for others? And how does it impact the strategy of your organization and its business model? How are you changing and evolving your products and services? How are you creating more sustainable business lines? How are you planning for the future? How are you communicating your strategy into the future? And therefore, standards and frameworks were also being developed for that outside-in perspective. And the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board had been developing standards in that area, and the Integrated Reporting Framework really helps to unify an organization's commitment to its broad stakeholders and its commitment to its investors, its providers of financial capital. So you have these kind of bridging frameworks as well. And what is now great about the development of the ISSB is that it was able to bring together those organizations that have been focused more on the enterprise value or the value for investors world, because that is the mandate of the IFRS Foundation. And so CDSB, the Climate Standards Board, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the IIRC and SASB have come together within the remit of the IFRS Foundation to help the ISSB to develop its standards. And there are two principles here that I would just highlight. One is that we are seeking to develop a global baseline, and we mean a global baseline. So at COP27, we took a proposal to emerging and developing economies that we wanted them to embrace the new ISSB sustainability disclosure standards. We want to work with partners across Asia, across Africa, and across Latin America to really help to build capacity to enable these standards to become part of the capital market infrastructure and help those economies to attract capital to finance green growth and green investment. So that's absolutely essential to our belief that we need a global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards for the capital markets. But secondly, we've adopted a building blocks approach. So we've really adopted, in a very competitive environment over the last 10 years, every organization has seemed to think that it has the answer to the sustainability reporting challenge. Well, there's now a recognition across these organizations that no one organization and no one philosophy does. We have to work together, and you need the inside out and the outside in to be compatible with one another. So we're developing MOUs and agreements to make sure that there is that compatibility or interoperability in the language between those different standards. Working to make sure that the language is unified so that when we say, use a particular term, we mean it across those different standards organizations, and we have a common structure. And it looks like TCFD is becoming that common framework to unify the different philosophies of standard setting. And so when a jurisdiction, and Malaysia may be one, but we've certainly been working across Asia and also Europe and the US SEC, when a jurisdiction decides that it wants to adopt its own set of standards, perhaps meeting a public policy objective, we've been engaging with the regulators in those markets to ensure that there's compatibility with the global baseline that we're developing and whatever jurisdiction level requirements are adopted in individual countries. And so that is a fundamental principle of the way the ISSB and the IFRS Foundation is proceeding.
So thanks, Jonathan. I know it talks about a lot of convergence, but I think a lot of us practitioners as well as corporates on the ground want to know that with all these convergence, does it mean I will now have one set of standards that everyone can connect to my financial statement? Because ultimately, I think everyone has already embarked on ESG reporting, and there is a performance table. But I think where the ISSB's ultimate objective is really to look at, with this ESG performance table, how does it impact my asset valuation? Does it mean I have impairment of my assets, stranded assets? Does it mean that my revenue will now start, my revenue recognition will change because of the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism? I'm going to pass through this tax, or I'm going to take it to my cost. So these are the real things that the accountants or the CFOs are already starting to think. If they're in the steel, if they're in fertilizer, or if they're in some of the exports to EU market. So I guess the key thing is, I guess the message is really, how do we ensure that there are sufficient guidelines when it comes to having this, being streamlined to avoid confusion when it comes to, we talk about impact to enterprise value. So impact is always accounting standards. How do that take into account? So I know this is coming out, so I will not put you on the spot, but I'm happy to actually move on. We will get these questions as we go into the next round. But I'm happy to have Duopharma, Mr. Ananda, to actually share as a practitioner, or at least from a corporate. Since 2015, you've gone on this journey. Feel free to share how has this benefited, and what are the challenges that you faced as you go through this journey?
Thanks for the question. First of all, good afternoon to all of you. My name is Ananda Rajah. I'm from Duopharma Biotech Berhad. Basically, it's a pharmaceutical manufacturing company. So we are a highly regulated industry. So these frameworks and all this regulation related to ESG and sustainability is something that we can adapt to fast. So basically, Duopharma has been producing sustainability reports since 2015. We see it as a way for us to create sustainable value for our shareholders and also other stakeholders. So we put in a lot of effort in creating the sustainability report, which is meaningful. I think that is key here. And anyone can come up with a report, but it should be meaningful and also beneficial to our stakeholders. So currently, we are guided by the Global Reporting Initiative and also by the Bursa Malaysia's Sustainability Reporting Guideline, as well as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But of course, we evolve to improve on a yearly basis. So we are currently looking at the new GRI Universal Standards. We are also looking into TCFD. As what was said earlier, it's already coming. So we are getting prepared to meet TCFD requirement. And also we are keeping our radar on the up and coming international sustainability standards boards as well. So to come up with reporting, sustainability report, as all of you are aware, so we have some common process here. One of the main process would be the stakeholder engagement. So we give a lot of emphasis. We spend a lot of time on this area. At least we take about 2 to 3 months at minimum. So we come up with this materiality assessment or review in every 2 to 3 years' time, because that's the best practice. You do it in between 2 or 3 years' time. Probably moving forward, you have to do that more frequently. And in between, we also perform our materiality validation. So those are the 2 things that we do. In terms of materiality assessment, we carry out our survey, stakeholder survey, materiality survey, focus group, and also questionnaires. And also in terms of materiality validation, we compare with the peer review. We look at the global trends, and also we look at the standard and also risk management. So what happened once we have finalized the materials, the materiality, we present to our board. So upon the approval of the board, then we'll map it against the GRI metrics. Why do we do that? We want to determine which material, we want to determine the prioritized material, which is more pertinent than the other materials. And as we are also listed under FTSE for Good, we are cognizant that we have to look at the gaps, and we also aspire to continuously improve on that to fulfill the FTSE for Good criteria. So that's on our process. So in terms of benefit, I think shareholders, they need an objective way to assess and also review companies' ESG performance. So definitely this sustainability report will provide them that guide. This can only be used as a tool, not as a whole, because not everything will be reported in the sustainability report. saying this, we have to be careful when we say we being transparent. We have to ensure that we report both the positive and also the negative impact. So it's easy to report on the positive impact, but it's quite tricky. It's a thin line when you want to report on the negative impact, but that carries a lot of weight by being transparent. Okay, so in terms of challenges, probably I'll just say one big challenge here. It's very time consuming because everyone they have plethora of job. Okay, and as was discussed earlier, sustainability is not done by only one department. Okay, everyone else they need to give their contribution, and on top of their day-to-day job, this is something that it deemed to be extra work for them. So that's one of the big challenges because the data are all scattered everywhere. Initially, when we started to do this report, definitely there's something that will be difficult and will be very challenging. So what we have done actually to minimize, we haven't eliminated, but what we have done to minimize is actually we have started to collect the data, on monthly basis. Not wait till the end of the year, then you start to chase for the data. That will be too late. And the benefit of collecting the data much earlier is if, let's say, there's anything, any discrepancies with the data, we can start to investigate, start to have investigation, discussion as early as possible. So those are some of the challenges that we face.
Thank you, Ananda. I guess the key thing is what we're seeing in the landscape is a lot of ESG reporting are still very manual-based, Excel, compilation on monthly, quarterly, or annual basis, rather than being proactively dashboard real-time, right? But one thing to share is actually that has been done in Malaysia corporates. And no surprising, we have also worked with a few leading organizations. But I guess the lesson learned is who are those that have already automated ESG reporting? No different from those who are under pressure, utility. So I won't mention which utility, but because ESG is such a forefront, you can't afford not to deliver services to businesses. So I won't say it's energy or water, but it's between that two. So these are the kind of companies who are already, we've worked with to actually automate it because, as you mentioned, Mr. Ananda, lack of resources, compiling data. You also have to think about if you have rubbish in and rubbish out. So automation of data is really going to be very important when you do not have sufficient skill sets. Because C-suites no longer can wait, they need dashboarding. And not only that, with emissions coming up, carbon taxonomy coming up, how would organizations now need to educate CFO, COO, CEO, HR on emissions? Those are also another key critical challenges we are seeing, especially in financial institutions, because of Bank Negara's push for 3 lines of defense, end-to-end, up until relationship manager, have to now think about what does emission mean for every dollar of financing that they are discussing. So this is what we are actually really seeing facing on the ground, right? But it's important to also come back to the conversation. With all these challenges, we do see that in Malaysia, there are leading corporates who also have started on climate disclosure. So maybe I'll go to back to CDP, because we've seen some corporates have embarked on CDP. The number of companies are not great. I'm sure you can mention who are those. I know Maybank is for a few years. But I guess the key thing is, what do you see is a challenge for those going on TCFD and how they can connect to CDP?
Yeah, so coming to the convergence question first. So mandatory regulation around TCFD, you see that convergence. When it comes to the standards, gradually you see more alignment around ISSB as the baseline. So we announced in COP27 our partnership with ISSB to basically adopt ISSB or incorporate ISSB into our questionnaire moving forward. So with that as well, hopefully ISSB and also GRI then will have alignment, and then they'll create a baseline of that moving forward, and it'll be easier for companies as well, because I know there've been a lot of questions around what do we adopt, etc. So that's the one. The next area will be target setting. Okay, once you collect the data, how do you set your targets around this as well? As mentioned, we don't deal with S and G, we only deal with E. At least in the E space, science-based targets, SBT, is the framework right now, the most commonly adopted framework for target setting around emission, and eventually how to get into that. Now, there are two challenges, I think, that the exposure drafts for ISSB are out already, for climate as well as the general one. But they're basically two issues, one being materiality, and the second one being assurance. Okay, and materiality, obviously, the first question is the climate on the environment, the climate on the corporate. What is the impact of climate on the corporate, of which usually the first set of risks are physical risks, right? Flooding, for example, increased weather events, etc. So usually that would be the first phase. But what's interesting also is we are moving to double materiality. That is also the impact of the company on the environment. The waste use, the water use, the resource use. So we are increasingly moving to the other aspect also, materiality. But we haven't even answered the first materiality before we answer the second, but directionally, this is where things are heading. So good news, convergence is happening. Bad news is going to include a lot more stuff, so to speak. And I think you essentially need to start preparing for that. And if you need any help, start with the first 25 metrics that most stock exchanges have come up with, because that creates some information data collection that you can start work on. And of course, then talk to your friendly consultant who can also develop methodologies as well to collect this as well.
Thanks for that, Mr. Donald. I guess the key question is, every time when I look at the CDP report, the key thing that I always look for, as you mentioned, is strategy. But for Malaysia, most of the time I want to know what are their impact to flood. Have they quantified the impact to flood on their operation disruption? What strategy do they have? What are the extent of their strategy? 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? So those are things that typically, if companies need to really build resilience, those are things that I find the most challenging.
No, it's true, because when we look at our questionnaire, transition planning is not there, and scenario planning, usually that are the biggest gaps actually in that, and obviously scope 3, right? So these are the 3 usual gaps within Malaysian companies, but also generally across Southeast Asia, because most people are still doing the first step, just doing their scope 1 calculation. So things will happen over time, but I think the first step is just to start with the basics first. And then you can progress then to your scope 3 calculation, eventually to your target setting, and eventually then to your implementation and transition plan as well. So some markets like in the EU and the US, they're into their transition planning already. Most markets in Southeast Asia are only at the first step for that as well. I'll give you an example of how some companies use it. I was in Taiwan last week. So actually one of the companies who have actually been supporting us for quite some time, use our questionnaire actually as a management tool. They'll actually extract our questions, put it up to their management and say, look, I need to answer these questions. Please give me the resources as well as the ability to answer these questions, because these questions are important. And my investors, my clients want the answers to these questions. So they use the questions as a way to develop their internal answers of how to address it. So whether you submit your answers to us is irrelevant, but you can freely use our questionnaire. It's public, as a way to start engaging your management, but also your stakeholders on how to actually address some of these issues, which are quite complex, to be fair, if you haven't started on that. So.
Yeah, so I want to come to Moody's for greenwashing. But before we go to greenwashing, I guess what we see in the market is not, as I mentioned, even for flood risk, what I've seen is only Tenaga, who has reported flood risk, physical risk, going down to their 3 power plants and 100 substations. What's the impact of flood risk? So I think coming from Moody's perspective, how do you rate if they are telling the truth? Because why? As financial institutions are also now building up data analytics on flood risk, physical risk, and transition risk carbon pricing, they're going to need to look for data. But what will transpire potentially is, are these data accurate, complete, correct? Or if these are reflective of the market, there are also very much discussions on how would this be priced in? Would insurance go up, cost, because of so much transparency? These are real things that are being discussed on pricing when it comes to that. So I think the key question for Moody's is, how do you sniff out when you do the rating and evaluation criteria?
Yeah, so I think still this is relevant for greenwashing, so I will talk about that first and then I'll talk about financial quantification. So I think greenwashing is definitely something, definitely an issue for Asia Pacific region and more broadly globally. We see that, for example, one thing I think we all touched upon is really companies need to align to a internationally recognized standard when they do reporting or when they do their ESG initiatives, and taking this, I think Donald touched upon this, carbon emission target setting as an example. Like when you do this kind of things, companies, instead of doing this, internally set or, unverified or like a vague claim about, what their decarbonization target is, they should probably refer to nowadays the SBTI. So that is really becoming a common, robust and science-based framework to actually guide corporates on target setting. And they also help you to basically validate, your process, your approach, and also the targets you made and whether that is indeed science-based. So I think that's one thing companies should think about when we're talking about, I think, transition risk, target setting. This not only help them to basically demonstrate they are following the best practice on the market, that enable us and also investors to better evaluate them, benchmark them. But also, I think they also, from their perspective, the corporates will be able to understand, what's the final vision or goal they're working towards, which is a 1.5 degree warming scenario that the SBTI is benchmarking against. So they also know what they're working against. I think that's also quite important. The second thing, I think is also, I think the way of communication really matters. So recently we were doing some deep dive into, companies' climate and ESG disclosures. And we were looking at, there are really some good examples on how companies really talk about the things they're doing and really being transparent and taking a step-by-step approach. So I can give one example. We were looking at a report from a global asset manager, and then a few years ago, they made a target basically saying, they want to link their executives' compensation to ESG performance. And then in the 2022 report, they actually talk about, review. In 2021, they actually linked 10% of their long-term incentive to ESG metrics such as climate and also diversity inclusion. But in addition to that, they also talk about, in 2023, what's their plan? They plan to increase that percentage from 10% to 20% and include a little bit more metrics like, customer engagement, product safety, this kind of things. So I think they're really being transparent about the way and also give out quantifiable, measurable data. So either investors or, ESG assessment firms like us knows how to evaluate the company and be comfortable with what they're trying to do. So I think that's really where we see we can guard from greenwashing. And coming back to Arina's question on how do we price in those kind of things? So from our perspective, we actually, in terms of the solution, we actually have two layers. The first layer is what we call risk identification. So let's taking, for example, physical risk. We actually have a pretty good model, interesting model that is location-based. So as long as we have the location, the address, or the coordinates of the location, we can actually do a risk screening across 7 physical hazards. We talk about like flood, heat stress, wildfire, typhoon, and even earthquake. And we provide a risk score, basically a risk exposure score for that real asset. And that's the first layer. The second layer is really about financial quantification. So when we know about, what's the impact of flood for that location, then we start to think about, what's the potential downtime cost, and then what's the potential cost per employee, and how that translates to financial impact on the company's earnings, on the company's cash flows. So we also have that basically capability built and in-house and also through acquisition to enable us to price in that physical risk impact into companies' performance. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, but I'm not going to let you off the hook yet.
Okay.
So sorry, because we talk a lot about evaluating the risk, but to what level that you see in this region that supply chain management gets a priority in rating or assessment? So,
yeah.
I guess going down, does it go by sector or importance or impact?
Yeah, so I think supply chain risk, there's several layers. So I think first one, still on greenwashing. This is actually also relevant because we see a lot of large corporates. There's greenwashing being, news break out, and it's not something they prepared because it's actually down their supply chain. So it's like, unintentional greenwashing. And if something happened, if you don't really have a procedure to manage your supply chain, that can really cause drastic reputational damage for your company. So that's one area. That's why we see in this region, we see more and more, regulations start to come in and look at supply chain. We noticed like a few months ago, Japan, they actually published their human rights due diligence in supply chain, the guidance. We also see Thailand, in their new One report, sustainability reporting, they actually come up with supply chain, disclosure requirement, and something happened in Hong Kong a few years ago. So we do see this is coming up as a really important part. And on the transition end, I think more and more people, I think the last panel we also discussed, we're handling scope 1, we're handling scope 2, and really, but for a lot of companies in the manufacturing space and also transportation, anything, the scope 3 is actually, the bulk of the emission. And then companies, in order to get, accurate data to do the scope 3 estimation or reporting, they really need to look down their supply chain, start to engage with their suppliers. So that's where, company like us, we also help companies, we also help corporates to actually, engage with their suppliers, get information from the suppliers, and then calculating their emissions. So that's something I think it's also quite important for supply chain. I don't know whether any...
No, thanks. I think it's good that you shared that because Malaysia has also, the government has ratified the ILO, and there's a timeline for forced labor to be managed within the supply chain. So that is already one of the agenda for most corporates to ensure that they not only look at emissions, but also to look at forced labor, but also considering the broader human rights policy that we see, if it's still fairly lacking. Not many companies, if you take out, they have a human rights policy to start with. They have whistleblowing policy, potentially grievance mechanisms, but not exactly a very proactive commitment on human rights. So that's something that we see is also gaining attraction aside from emission. So maybe Ananda, I'll come back to you because I think you've been in this. So hearing from what Moody's have also shared, maybe some thoughts on the ground?
Yeah, on greenwashing, right? Okay. I lately, I come across greenwashing a lot, meaning the discussion on greenwashing. But what caught me was about the unintentional greenwashing. So that might sound absurd, but whatever said and done, at the end of the day, the reporting company needs to be responsible, whether it's done intentionally. I mean, intentionally is something that you can't get away. So we have to be very mindful about this. So, and there are a lot of cases. In fact, yesterday I just read one of the leading, global leading investment company has been fined because they misled their clients in terms of ESG. So we can see a lot of things happening in financial sectors, but that doesn't mean it is not happening in other areas. So I think this is something that we have to educate our employees. Each department, when they disclose any data, they have to be careful. They have to analyze. They have to think whether this data is the right data, are we exaggerating? Are we oversaying things but doing less? So I think same goes to the labeling. I know some companies say, okay, we are doing all this and this conforms to all the standard, but in actual, it does not. Another way I see how to reduce, not to say eliminate, reduce greenwashing would be tightening the regulation. EU has already started to work on this. In fact, they are the final draft. In fact, EU, they are doing a lot of other things in terms of having one global standard for the framework for the greenwashing. And in fact, they are going to come up with a standard for the rating agency as well. So I feel tightening the regulation would be one step forward for ASEAN country.
Thank you, Mr. Ananda. But I have one follow-up question. So not to put you on the spot, but to what extent you feel that the ESG due diligence is going to be becoming more and more pertinent within your supply chain?
Okay, I think probably we are referring to assurance. Yeah, definitely it is under scrutiny. All the ESG performance data, whatever we disclose, will be under the spotlight. So what we are doing in my company, in Duopharma, of course, we are appointing a third-party assurance company. It is a limited assurance, but nevertheless, we assure all the critical data, probably the carbon dioxide emission under Scope 1 and Scope 2 for now. And we are working on Scope 3. Probably we'll be able to disclose soon. So that is one thing that we can work on. That's my point of view.
Thank you, Mr. Ananda. I'm going to open a question to the panelists because I think we've heard, them being somewhat taking questions from me. But any questions from Slido, feel free to key in. Otherwise, I'll go straight further for more questions. I guess the key thing is with CDP. Now, we're also going to talk about carbon pricing, right? And when we talk about carbon pricing, what's important is emissions number as well as pricing. So when it comes to emissions and pricing, what are your views in terms of what companies are going to disclose versus what's reality in the carbon market?
Okay, I think firstly, what is the purpose of internal carbon pricing? Firstly, there is external carbon pricing within countries, right? So just to give you a framework, most countries have a net zero target. They want to get to net zero by a certain period, 2050, 2060. So they then have a line they need to try to meet. And basically, the pricing is a trade-off or creating a planning tool to trade off for that. Now, what does it mean for companies to have an internal carbon pricing tool? It is essentially a planning tool, okay? It is a planning tool for capital investment for 10 to 20-year period. Over this 10 or 20-year period, the effects of climate change will start happening. And how then do you incorporate those costs, which are not there right now, but will be there over a period of 5 to 10 years? Okay, so that is actually the purpose of internal carbon pricing. The second one is, what is the scope? Where do you apply it to? So typically it'll be large investments, for example, production facilities, for example. Where do you want to locate your production facility? Where do you want to make large investments into infrastructure, for example? Why will you do this? Because then, for example, if you have a production facility next to a sea, over the 10 to 20-year period, what is the risk of, say, rising sea levels, for example, and how does that impact you? So these are mechanisms for where you want to incorporate pricing of carbon, but also pricing of risk into your models. And then you get a better idea how to plan as well. Now, what is important also is notice what's happening in the external market. So governments essentially need to drive down carbon. They need to cap most carbon emission by 2030. That's not very far. That's only about 7 or 8 years away. So within 7 or 8 years, essentially they need to drive carbon down. And there are only two ways of doing it. Either you have very large incentive packages, like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. So massive basic incentive packages to encourage the development of the green industry. Or you introduce a mechanism for taxation and trade-off. And that's where the external carbon pricing mechanism works in most countries. It is a trade-off mechanism, essentially how to trade off those who are emitting and those essentially who are sucking carbon. Actually, the trees, for example, nature, and many other new technologies that might develop from carbon capture. So I think it is a reflection of what's happening in the external environment, and primarily it's a planning tool for you to understand where things move and how do you plan your investment moving forward. There are 4 frameworks. We have got a paper on it, so there's 4 frameworks that you can adopt, 4 methodologies that you can adopt, and it really depends on which type of investment you're making that you can, but I won't go into that detail at this stage. So.
Thank you, Donald. So we received some questions from the floor, and I think one come out very interestingly, which I think, Jonathan, I think is aimed for you, but Mr. Ananda can give your practical viewpoint. So we do see that international standards are critical when it comes to transforming climate commitment into effective action. What's your view using ISO standards for ISSB?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really interesting question. And the ISO, the International Standards Organization, was part from 2014 of something called the Corporate Reporting Dialogue, which was in many ways a precursor to a lot of the consolidation that we've seen. And where the role that the ISO standards play are really in the whole purpose of the internal controls of a company, of getting the information flowing through the business so that the information can actually be used within the organization itself, and you've got those internal controls in place. The reason that that is so important, and we've been touching very much on the external side, the corporate reporting standards, and what you would see visibly and publicly. And there are 2 points I would make here. One is that is only one side of the coin, because we believe that corporate governance and corporate reporting go hand in hand. So what you've really got to do is put those internal controls in place and enable the data to flow through the business. And in a very, very practical sense, the really important point from our perspective isn't so much just to get the transparency for transparency's sake. We've almost moved beyond that from a corporate reporting perspective. We need that transparency in order to ensure that key risks and opportunities are cascaded through the business, particularly up to the board and top management of the companies at an earlier stage so that action can be taken. By having those by using the ISO standards, putting those internal controls in place, you can, for example, make sure that, I mean, if you think about it, who is it who sets the agenda for board meetings? This sounds very practical and very kind of in the weeds, but it's actually the company secretary within the organization, within your companies mostly. So how do you put in place the systems within the organization so that the company secretary has enough of an understanding of the key risks that the company is exposed to, so that he or she elevates that and puts it onto the board agenda, so that the board and top management of the company are actually considering the key risks facing the business. There are a number of board directors that we speak to who say, oh, well, we wish we had time to discuss the strategic issues in our board meetings because so much of our board agendas are taken up by compliance issues and issues that really are not the strategic risks and opportunities faced by the business. So I think by using the ISO standards, putting in place those internal controls, getting the governance mechanisms correct within the business so that the information cascades through the organization, particularly to top management, is absolutely essential.
Thanks, Jonathan. But one thing I think we've heard on the ground is a lot of companies, as part of their tendering process, to be on the preferred list of their customer, typically they will go for ISO standards, right? But that's no longer what we see of today enough unless the ISO also has a certain assessment of the performance data. So if you go for health and safety or environmental management or emissions, the right questions to be asking is, yes, while you have a very good process and it's being checked and you have your ISO certification, does it mean your performance data table is accurate? Is anyone opining on this data? So that's also what companies are actually moving towards. Having a certification, having a process is no longer enough. It's coming to the performance table. So I guess the next question is going on to more specific real case. So for Mr. Ananda, for Duopharma, can you share what are the sustainability initiative program that has been successful? What is the learning case for local corporates to say that, this is something, if I want to bring to the board, it will give me the return from a sustainability initiative?
Yep. Thanks for that great question. Before I answer that question, you see, it all began with our 5-year ESG strategy. So that was the first time we formulated that ESG strategy. So in that strategy, we have included all our initiatives. Of course, we started off with the gap analysis from where we are and to where we want to be. And we took that, to the table and discussed, okay, how are we going to close the table? How are we going to close the gaps? So with that, all these initiatives came about. So if we off record, if I can say, we probably have about 40 to 45 initiatives, which is actively ongoing, and we are tracking those initiatives. We have just started the strategy in year 2022. This year, it is still fresh from the oven. So in terms of successful initiative program, of course, as all of you are aware, we have a pledge to our carbon neutral by 2030, net zero by 2050, and also reducing the single-use plastics into 50% by year 2026. So we start from there, and we have all the initiatives. So we are still tracking. We are looking at the year-to-year results, just like what you told, our moderator told. We have to look at our performance, creating the internal metrics and also the results. Duopharma, just to note one, we have done well in governance area, okay, especially in, let's say, in anti-corruption and also anti-bribery. So we have run that program for past few years. Of course, we started off with a low keynote, and now we are doing very well on that area. So in terms of energy efficiency, okay, again, we have done our full energy and also water audit. So based on the proposal, we have done a few actions. We have taken few actions. We have done few initiatives, and we can see some tangible good results, which we have already disclosed in our reporting.
Thank you, Mr. Ananda. So we have 5 minutes left, and I know the number one question that came up, I'm going to tweak the most popular question, and this doesn't go to you, Mr. Ananda, because you're from corporate, so I'm putting the 3 other gentlemen on the spot, right? In your mind, name the top ESG leader that comes to your mind first, a company, and what are the attributes you've seen? May not be they're good in everything. So maybe I'll start with Mr. Donald. Every gentleman, Donald, Jonathan, you all have a chance to name one company and why.
Okay.
As the closing remark.
I'll be unfair. Apple. Apple has a 2030 net zero target across all products. It means that if you're a supplier to Apple, you need to be net zero very soon, because all Apple products will be net zero by 2030.
Okay, Jonathan?
I shouldn't name an individual company as it's against the rules, I think, of the IFRS Foundation. But as we're among friends, I think Unilever is always the company that comes to mind. And the reason is that when they had the ambition to double the size of the business, they decided that they wanted to do that in a completely sustainable way. And so they changed their entire business model, and they produced products that, detergents and soaps and so on that didn't require the use of water, so that they could take those into developing and emerging markets where maybe there's greater water stress. And so they completely changed and evolved their business model in order to power the growth, but to do that in a completely sustainable way. And I think when I think about reporting and the world that I've been occupying for the last 10 years of my life, really the reason I've been doing it is because I want to see that change happen at a governance level and at a business model level, because I think if we don't make that change happen through the system, not just in reporting, but through the system, then we're never going to meet those ambitions that all our governments have signed up to, particularly around sustainable development.
Daniel?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't really make a non-financial corporate, but maybe a financial corporate like Aviva. So they do insurance, they do investment management. So I encourage, if you get interested, you can look at their reports. That is pretty amazing. In terms of how they describe the things they do, and they truly have a framework in place. But also part of the question is also talking about how they have been successful in achieving that. I think from our assessment perspective, when we evaluate a company, we look at not only their commitment, but also we look at actually how they implement different things, and also the result achieved. And the result, for example, we actually monitor the news, we do controversy screening of all the topics the company is involved in. So I think for a company to be a leader in their sector or in their location, they need to really be coherent about their commitment and their implementation, and there is result that people can track. I think that is quite important. Yeah.
Thanks, Daniel. So as to sum up, I think we've had quite a good, robust discussion. The panels are going to be out for lunch. You can still reach out to them if you have more burning questions. But I think to sum it up, I think on today's landscape and today's panel, there's 3 things of key takeaway that we should be focusing on. The first one, I think we got to really look at data as very much looking at what you're communicating is going to be, you need quality and transparency because they're going to come after you. What you put out, you can't backtrack unless you restate your data. That's one. So second is, I think digitalization of these data is going to be critical and worthwhile investment. But that's also something company needs to decide. Because the more data and analytics you go for, you're able to inform strategy faster, rather than doing it on an annual basis or an aftermath review. And the last but not least is enterprise value. I guess the key thing is, as ISS become about, as well as the carbon taxonomy coming about, I think a lot of corporates will now want to know, how would all these hit my enterprise value? So those are the kind of questions that the board level are also ramping up to ask the right question. But the form of the twist is, they're going to ask, if I'm going to put my financial next 5 years, what are my ESG outcomes that I'm going to get from the next 5 years investment? So with that, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this panel. We'll see you for lunch.
Thank you, Ms. Arina Kok. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for the moderator, Ms. Arina Kok, and the panelists. The reporting panel, Beyond Price and Quality, ESG Impact as a third value-added credential.